Welcome, everyone. This is our fourth webinar for the Community Land Trust webinar series, How to Establish a Community Land Trust. Our previous webinars were starting last year, December, Community Land Trust 101 with one of our panelists today, Jason Webb from Grounded Solutions Network. Our second webinar was in January, Community Land Trust of Connecticut, and that featured the Salisbury Housing Trust, the Southeast Connecticut Community Land Trust, and the Naugatuck Valley Housing Development Corporation associated with the Naugatuck Valley Project. And then the next webinar was in February, Managing a Community Land Trust with Brenda Torpy. Brenda Torpy was slated to join us tonight, but unfortunately, she's fallen sick and ill and will not be able to join us tonight. So tonight we will be having presentations from Jason Webb from Grounded Solutions Network, as well as Anika Singh Lemar. Before we move on, though, we will initiate a poll. We do this every webinar to see what our folks' knowledge of community land trusts. And so if that poll could be initiated, you will see there are three questions. Take a minute or two for those to be filled out. If you're just coming in, a poll is being taken right now. If you've wrapped up filling out the poll, look to the chat if you've not joined us for our prior webinars to see the links for prior webinars in the Community Land Trust series that we've been running. Okay, let's see the results from the poll. Great. Okay, so there's a range of knowledge here with folks from a range of backgrounds on community land trusts. And so let's proceed. So as I stated, today we're being joined by Jason Webb. He's the community and technical assistance principal at the Ground Solutions Network. Jason has close to 40 years of experience in community organizing and revitalization. He was instrumental in the revitalization of a community in Roxbury, Massachusetts called Dudley Street, as highlighted in the award-winning documentaries Holding Ground, Gaining Ground, and the book called Streets of Hope. At Grounded Solutions, his primary area of work is to support nonprofit organizations and public agencies to explore, adopt, and implement housing policies and programs with lasting affordability that advance racial equity and inclusion. Jason has led technical assistance engagements in over 50 communities, such as Louisville, Kentucky, Memphis, Tennessee, Baltimore, Maryland, Durham, North Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. He serves as the primary point of contact for fee-for-service arrangements by providing subject matter expertise. Before we go to Jason, I'll also introduce Anika. And again, notice that Brenda Torpy will not be joining us tonight. Anika Singh Lemar is a clinical professor of law at Yale Law School, where she teaches clinics that represent affordable housing developers, tenants, homeowners, small businesses, community development financial institutions, fair housing advocates, and cooperatives. Anika Singh Lemar writes about land use, zoning, and housing. She served 2 terms as editor-in-chief of the American Bar Association's Journal of Affordable Housing and Community Development Law and has been a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute's Metropolitan Policy Project. She's currently a member of the board of New Haven Bank and president of the Connecticut Bar Foundation. Prior to joining the law school faculty, Anika Singh Lemar practiced real estate law at a Connecticut law firm. She began her career as a law clerk for the Honorary Janet C. Hall of the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut, and later as a fellow and staff attorney at the Community Development Project of the Urban Justice Center, which has since been renamed to Take Root Justice in New York. So first, I will hand this off to Jason.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Again, my name is Jason Webb. I serve as the Community and Technical Assistance Principal at Grounded Solutions Network. Um, we are known to be one of the national experts when it comes to setting up community land trust. And currently, right now, we have quite a few that we are actually working on throughout the entire country. But tonight's conversation, I wanted to get into a little bit more of the methodology that we have created over the years when it comes to setting up a community land trust. Where do you start? What are some of the tools that are available to actually everybody to create these types of models? One of the things that is important to acknowledge is that for a number of years, the community land trust practitioners have created different networks. And one of the key things that they always wanted was to make sure that a lot of the base docs, a lot of our model docs were open source. So, with that, I want to actually present to folks what is a development that we developed probably about 10 years ago now, which is the startup pathway. And this was actually a labor of love that I did for about 2 years with the National CLT Network, as we were trying to figure out how do we actually show folks what could be the next step in creating a community land trust. What we got a lot were questions that would constantly come up to say, well, I know I have to do this, but what's next? So we wanted to make sure that we created this visual roadmap for folks that laid out six important questions that we felt like needed to be answered. So, like the first question is, does your community have a shared vision for the change that it wants to see? As we know, community land trusts are rooted in the idea of community coming together, being organized, and really taking hold of their own destiny. And then it goes down the line where you have a number of other questions. Like the second question is, have you decided who the community land trust and how you will serve the individuals with your CLT? Is it only about housing, or is it about some of the other community important elements that make up a community? The third one is, have you decided on the organizational and governance structure for your community land trust? Are you starting a community land trust from the scratch, from the ground up? Or are you convincing an existing nonprofit to restructure themselves into a community land trust? The next one is, do you have an implementation plan for the next 12 months? Again, when we think about this, and this has been really successful because this model is relatively still new, even though it is 54 plus years old, and there's close to 400 of them in the United States, a lot of folks still are skeptic around this idea of a community land trust. What we have found to be really helpful is to actually create a planning document. Some groups have called it a business plan, other groups have called it just a community land trust planning document that would allow for, the community to ask a lot of the questions and to be able to get a lot of those answers and put them down in writing for when you are building partnerships and building additional support. The fifth question really starts to talk about, do you have the resources to go ahead and start this idea of a community land trust? Now, coming off of this business plan, you want to start to figure out, well, what do these budgets look like for the organization and for your inaugural project that you want to get started? Now, there have been community land trusts that have started on a wide range of different types of scale. I have had CLTs that have started incredibly small with maybe just a neighborhood garden that they wanted to go ahead and put in. to maybe their first home that they have gotten through an acquisition or maybe a donation. And then I've had CLTs that have started with creating a new subdivision of over 200 homes over the next number of years. So it is important to understand what is that level of resources that you need for this execution of the community land trust. And last but not least, it is about, do you have the groundwork for your first project? And a lot of times the groundwork is truly, what is your program design? Have you thought about your what's going to go into your ground lease, into your affordable pricing and resale formulas? Have you started to recruit the lenders that are needed and started to build out what that education for those potential partners look like and for potential homeowners? So this is what we have actually up on our website for Grounded Solutions, is really to go through these six important questions, and we have some suggested activities. And this is within inside of our resource that we make public called the Startup Hub. And the Startup Hub actually has over 30 resources at your disposal. Grounded Solutions wants to make sure that we can amplify this idea of continuing to promote the idea of how do you start up a community land trust is by going through these six important questions and utilizing the tools and resources that we've made available at the URL that's on the screen. And again, it can be a daunting process. It is a lot of decisions that need to be made. And one of the important things that a number of community land trusts work on is, how do we build the C in CLT? How do we make sure that the community is with us along the way? We also have a number of CLTs that have been started with the understanding that they already have the C and that they need the L and the T, the land and the trust, to be able to get really off the ground. In addition to this resource, one of the things that I put together is also another helpful resources that are, again, publicly sourced, that folks would be able to, able to actually download and utilize. So one is the Community Land Trust Technical Manual. Now, in 2011, the CLT practitioners were actually very, very busy throughout the country, because what we were doing was laying a lot of our model documents, which also included this technical manual. Now, this technical manual is 482 pages long. It is a beast of a document, but it honestly will explain every aspect of what goes into a community land trust and what some of those decision points need to be. It will also give you what are some of the most common options that were happening in 2011. Community Matters is actually a book that a number of practitioners got together with the facilitation of John Davis to really start to highlight and reflect on, how does resident engagement in community land trust look from CLT to CLT. So Community Matters, I feel like, is an important book that you're continuing to center and understand that the engagement of CLTs is not just one way, but there is a variety of that resident engagement that CLTs have historically done. Homes in Hands is actually one of the first documentaries that was created by the Institute for Community Economics. And Homes in Hands really highlights three separate community land trusts. One is Durham Community Land Trustees, which I will say in Durham, North Carolina, and they are turning 50 years old this year, which is a huge feat as being one of the older community land trusts. The other two CLTs that are highlighted in that documentary is Albuquerque with Sawmill Community Land Trust and how that community land trust got started, and the Burlington Community Land Trust, which is now known as the Champlain Housing Trust. So all three of those community land trusts, some of our older community land trusts are highlighted, excuse me, with inside of this documentary. Grounded Solutions Network went ahead and a number of years ago wanted to make sure that as we were starting to see community land trusts continue to flourish in the country, we wanted to also create a tool and a resource to help folks to understand what are some of the policies, especially around their housing policies that are needed in government to support CLTs, to support this idea of inclusive growth. And how do we make sure that housing is centered to that? So I wanted to make sure that we highlighted that. And the Lincoln Land Institute for Land Policy worked with John Davis and a number of practitioners to come up with what is, I think, the largest collection of text, historical texts on community land trust. And a number of us as practitioners went ahead and actually put in our more current pieces on what is a community land trust and how does that actually implement itself. So these are just some of the additional helpful resources that I wanted to highlight, and I look forward to the question and answer period. And with that, I am going to say thank you and pass it back to Alex.
Hi everyone again. Please look to the bottom for the Q&A function. You'll see the way it might be showing up on your screen is there's the More button, the circle with three dots, and you'll see within that a Q&A box. It'll say Q&A with a box above it that has a question mark. So feel free to put your questions in there and we'll get to them after the next presentation. Uh, also, if the interpreter wanted to also make an announcement about interpretation as well for those who might be on or might be joining us who might be in need of interpretation. Okay. If not, again, for those who are joining us as well, on that same More button, you'll see a globe with interpretation there as well. Great. Okay, so next we will go to Anika Singh Lemar. Anika?
Thanks, Alex. Oh, there we go. Thanks. That was great, Jason. And as a beneficiary many times over of the open source grounded solutions materials, let me just start off by saying thank you to you all for the materials that you've made available. I know they've helped me and they've helped a lot of others. I want to thank the Housing Collective for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the startup process for CLTs with a little bit of focus here in Connecticut. I am an attorney by trade, and I work with small community-based efforts to build affordable housing of all types around the state, including affordable homeownership, affordable rental, uh, developments that are owned by housing authorities, nonprofits, occasionally for-profit developers as well, where there's an affordable component. And CLTs are one piece of what we do. So I'm obviously going to focus in on that here today. So I'm going to pull up a couple of slides, not too many, I promise. Okay. So for those who attended previous webinars in this series, you've heard a lot about the ways in which community land trusts are different from other kinds of affordable housing and other kinds of nonprofits in terms of the tripart governance structure, the permanent affordability, and the separation of the land from the improvements in a way that allows for a long-term ground lease to preserve permanent affordability and also permanent community control over the land. In terms of the way that community land trusts provide housing, in terms of the way you develop housing, it looks very similar to other kinds of entities. And when you think about startup, you do have to anticipate and look ahead to all the components of what the development process looks like. So I've set a number of those out here, and we'll talk in a couple of minutes um, about the way in which these components of the process of what you actually have to do to build housing then inform how to think about setting up your entity, setting up your community land trust. So, right off the bat, if you're going to do housing, you need land. You've got to find a piece of land. Sometimes that's gifted, sometimes that's purchased, sometimes it's land that nobody else wants, sometimes it's land that's in very high demand. But in any event, no one is going to talk to you about funding or permits until you have some kind of site control, whether that's an option to purchase property or a contract or actual ownership. Another huge input and big component that's required for home development and increasingly required with every year that goes by is some kind of expertise. Most startup, locally based nonprofits do not have a track record or history of doing any kind of housing construction. And today, these days, if you're going to rely on any kind of charitable funds or public subsidy, not only do you need to have a track record of housing construction, you probably need a track record of the specific industry segment that is affordable construction. So there are ways to get your hands on that kind of expertise if you don't have it to begin with, most commonly through hiring a consultant who works in the field, finding a co-developer who can do a project with you. That can be complicated in the CLT setting in a way that it may not be less complicated in a rental setting, or by hiring staff. You're also going to need permits. So I went back and watched the previous webinars in the series and absolutely loved the gentleman from Salisbury who, if those of you who are not familiar with 830G or the kinds of land use and zoning procedures that are required to do housing at any kind of scale in the state of Connecticut, I would recommend going back and watching that one too. But it's not just zoning, it's also inland wetlands, getting permits to do hook up to public water or do well water, hook up to sewer, or put in sufficient septic. Um, those are all pieces of the process as well. You're at some point in all of this going to have to get funding. Previous webinars talked about local property tax exemptions, but there's also charitable funding. Decent buckets here in the state of Connecticut. We're lucky that the state does make decent investments in affordable housing construction, um, and to some degree federal. And then finally, when you get to the end, you're hopefully going to close and bring all these pieces together. And that's, when you're going to need to bring in some of that other kinds of expertise. Um, for our purposes, one thing to keep in mind about all of this is that there are components of this that you can do while you're developing your plan and your strategy and your governance and your ground lease and that tripartite structure. And there are components of this that you can only really get to once all of that is fully baked. And keeping in mind what you can do when is going to be a big piece of developing that strategy. So there are components of this that you can do with a few good folks, no legal entity, no 501c3, no board, no membership. There are components of this that you really can't do until you have formed a what we call a Connecticut non-stock corporation, which is an entity. There are components of this that you can't do until you have 501c3 status. There are components of this that the entity can do before you've really built out the membership and board structure. Um, but we'll dig into a little bit of that now. So, you might one thing to keep in mind is that in between some of this, there may be some middle ground. So sometimes startups will partner with a fiscal sponsor, um, so that they get the benefits of the 501(c)(3) status and the ability to apply for some of that charitable funding before they've actually got their own 501(c)(3) status off the ground. So you might say, Anika, you're a lawyer, like. Oh, why can't you do PowerPoint? You're a lawyer telling us that a few good folks can do a thing and that we don't have to form a corporation doesn't sound very lawyerly. And that might be right, but there are costs to setting up a 501(c)(3). And if you set it up too early in the process, there are actually real hazards. And I've seen a lot of organizations get waylaid by the process of setting up a 501(c)(3), and it frankly is just a huge distraction for them from the process of building housing. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're finessing your bylaws instead of finding land. If you can do both, if you can walk and chew gum at the same time, obviously that's ideal, but that can be very hard for local community-based organizations. So if you can locate a fiscal sponsor that can help you start to do some of that applying for funding and the like, and delay setting up your own 501(c)(3) for a minute, that allows you to focus on the substance of the work, finding the land, building the relationships, figuring out what kind of housing you want to do, rather than process. It allows you to develop your membership and governance model over time based on the experience of actually working with people on the ground, as opposed to setting up something that might look real good on paper but doesn't work in the real world. You can avoid setting up an entity for a project. Sometimes projects don't come to fruition. And especially if you're really hyper local, if the only thing you care about is 6 townhomes in a particular neighborhood in a particular town in Connecticut, then you really don't want to set something up until you know for sure that that thing is going to happen. And the delay can also enable partnerships and community building across networks. When Brenda was here a few weeks ago, she talked about a lot of the consolidation that's going on among Vermont CLTs. And it's not just Vermont, where existing CLTs that do not intend to do further development are finding that in order to really achieve efficiencies of property management and the like, that they need to come together and work together in terms of staffing. And you may find that you're better off partnering at the get-go, not setting up a new thing that you're going to end up merging into another thing 6 years down the line anyway, and starting off in more of a partnership. So I've stolen the graphic here from the National Council of Nonprofits, and it just spells out a little bit of the kinds of considerations that might go into a fiscal sponsorship relationship, but also happy to answer questions about that. Another reason to put off formation is that I'll tell you, the clinic that I teach does do formation and 501(c)(3) applications for a number of nonprofits across the state and sometimes out of state. And as soon as our clients get their 501(c)(3), we hand them a 8-page memo that looks like this. And it's all of the paperwork that they now need to do now that they're a 501(c)(3). I'll just scroll through that again so you can see. This is all paperwork you need to do that no attorney, in all likelihood, is going to do for you for free. Those compliance things are now your job as a 501(c)(3). So until you're ready for that, 10-page memo about the paperwork you need to do, there are good reasons to put it off. In terms of Connecticut specific law, there is a statute in Connecticut that governs community land trusts that sets out what their governance must look like. There are details that you can fill in, but there are some baseline requirements. You have to be a membership organization. As a CLT, you're almost certainly going to be structured as a membership organization anyway. What does that mean? It means that you have people who are kind of like shareholders in the sense that they elect your board of directors. They don't own shares in the entity because you're a nonprofit and there are no shares or profits to be divvied up, but there is governance to be divvied up, and those members elect the board. In Connecticut, you have to be open to members of the general public who support your goals and purposes, and no more than 30% of the members of the organization can reside outside of the town in which the community land trust operates. That's just because we're highly parochial and we like to bake it into law in our little state. Um, and then that membership has to elect at least a majority of the board. And then, as you can see here, the statute sets out what percentage of the governing board must be made up of residents. Um, and you heard in previous sessions about the tripartite structure of including community and local officials as well. It's important to keep in mind that you're going to have in this governance structure membership that elects the directors, but then the entity is also going to bring on expertise. And so that'll include staff. It will also include some of those folks that were in the earlier slide in terms of property management and the development process and getting you to closing. It's worth saying that there is a statute that exists in Connecticut, but it doesn't dictate that you can't do a different kind of CLT. The only reason you would have to follow the statute is if you were applying for funding from the state that was limited to CLTs that met the statutory requirements. And to my knowledge, the state has not made funding available for CLTs as defined in statute for since, oh, I don't know, I mean, maybe 30 years. So there may come a time when the state makes money available to CLTs that meet this statutory definition. But until then, you can treat this as guidance and by no means dictating what your structure looks like. You can have you can open up your membership generally to people who care about affordable housing, whether or not they live in your tony little suburb. You can have your membership elect 100% of the governing board. You can have 60% of your board be, you can play with these numbers, but this is what is currently in state statute as of today. So just going back to that original slide, and this is the final slide. And thinking about at what point in the process you need to set up what sort of entity. I'm just positing some hypotheses right here based on my own experience working with small nonprofit developers, both CLTs and otherwise, and what aspects of the development process you can do at different stages in the formation process. You know, in terms of finding land, like you do not need a fully structured, set up 501c3 CLT to start looking for land and land donations and the like, and you probably will do yourself a little bit less brain damage if you stick to like that initial group of a few good folks to do that process. Now, by the time you're actually acquiring the land and getting title to it, you're going to need at least a fiscal sponsor, right? So that's the kind of timeline issue that's going to come up. You can probably find some expertise consultants and the like as a small group of volunteers. But once you're hiring staff, you're going to need to have an entity with an employer identification number and a bank and the like. Um, you can go ahead and apply for approvals with your entity, but maybe your governance structure is not fully built out. And again, the governance structure probably benefits from experience rather than, again, setting something up that looks real good on paper and highly democratic on paper, but just doesn't work in real life. But then now by the time you're closing on funding and closing on the property, you're going to need to set up your entity, your 501c3. You're going to need to do those 10 pages plus of legal compliance. You're going to have your membership in place, and you're probably going to have to set up some property specific entities as you move forward, depending on what kind of CLT you're doing. And I will say that the CLTs that I've worked with have been focused on multifamily. Largely as a result of the scale of the housing crisis we're in right now. We ain't going to solve it with a lot of single family homes on 2-acre lots. So that is, single family homes are certainly a valuable form of CLT, but we have focused on multifamily, both small and larger. Okay. And I'll leave it at that. I'm really looking forward to talking to people and answering some questions.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you both for your presentations. So again, as a reminder, folks, please use the Q&A function to drop in your questions, and we will get to them. But I'll run through some questions that I have. So to kick off, who can start a community land trust? Can a for-profit entity or private landowner establish a community land trust, or is it just for nonprofits and municipalities?
Jason, you
Do
want,
Do
you,
you
yeah.
do you want to do the legality and I can do the
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, I've sort of alluded to this already, but there isn't in Connecticut anyway, like a strict legal definition of what a um, community land trust is, in the sense that if what's important to you is separating the land from the built improvements and then having a ground lease that requires permanent affordability, then anybody can do that, right? Like I could do that today with my house, um, and say, I want this to be permanently affordable. I'm gonna, move out and turn it into four apartment. I could do that today, and I could continue to own my house, and just, but that's not like generally what we think of colloquially when we think of a CLT. So, um, if you uh, believe in the sort of community-driven version of a CLT, where you've got a membership nonprofit that has this tripartite board structure, then this typically going to be it's typically going to be a 501(c)(3). But there is a little bit of a buffet here, right? Where you can pick and choose which aspects of this model are attractive to you. And if they're fundable and achievable, then that's great.
Yeah, and for me, I would just continue to remind folks as to what the founders of this model really illuminated in terms of their core elements of what creates a CLT. It is this form of that there needs to be a governance structure, and that their tripartite board structure is what the founders truly felt like was bringing those three elements together. It was also this idea that this nonprofit should be structured as a democratically structured nonprofit. Now, how you do that is, I think, the flavor of the month, but that the founders truly believed that, this board needed to have some accountability mechanism back to a membership. And then there is the idea of this ground leasing piece. So earlier today, I had a group call me and say, we don't want to do ground leases, but we want to do a CLT. And I said to them, well, according to the founders, then you don't really have a CLT. You have a really great lasting affordability mechanism in doing a deed restriction, but the founders truly believe that a ground lease is what made it more unique than any other form of housing. The other thing that I'll just point out to folks is a number of practitioners actually in 1992 was successful in getting a definition actually in the federal registry of what constituted a CLT. And that is still there to this day. And it's something that, is baked into the HUD definition of what is a CLT nationwide.
Right. I mean, the question with any kind of legal definition like that is to what end, right? So if HUD came out with a funding source tomorrow that said this money is limited to folks who meet the regulatory definition of a CLT in this Federal Register, then great. But if, short of that, it doesn't, nobody should feel beholden to, a legal definition that doesn't get them anything.
Yeah, and for me, I would actually disagree as a longtime practitioner of doing this model that these definitions that practitioners have used based on the founder's original text of this model is incredibly important. So to the point of, yes, there should be funding tied to it, but at the same time, there were measures put in place to try to make sure that we don't have bad actors come in and actually undermine this CLT model now that we're actually getting more traction all throughout the country.
Fair enough, but we live in a world where tomorrow HUD could say the definition of a CLT is a private equity owned luxury multifamily, right? Like there's no, I just need to say like there's no magic to law, right? So right now, today, you like the definition of CLTs that happens to be in federal regulation, but it could suck tomorrow. And I don't want people to think that there's like magic sauce to words that are in the law when the thing that you might come up with on your own might be better.
Okay. Um, so I'm glad we're having a full-on discussion about the different parameters of like what it means to engage in this work. Uh, with that, who should be brought in as supporters of a startup CLT? That has been mentioned a bit, but if we could get even a little more specific or drill in.
Yeah, so from my perspective, anybody and everybody. I mean, we've had philanthropic funders come in to actually endow the startup of CLTs with the understanding that, again, the structure of the CLT works for the community. But we've had CLTs that now have, tens of millions of dollars in back of them as a mechanism around scaling. So that's usually one that a lot of folks sometimes get very squeamish about in terms of bringing money to the table and having sometimes what would be large money at the table. And that comes from just the grassroots of this model coming up and trying to have everything fundraised locally, but sometimes having some of those larger actors really buy into this with the understanding that their buy-in doesn't also include control, that the control stays within inside of the community. But, I think funders is one that a lot of groups sometimes takes their free money, but doesn't actually dig more deeper into what else those funders could possibly do to lift up your community land trust.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it all goes back to that first slide and feasibility, right? Like, who's going to enable you to get this thing going? And that really is going to be folks who check a lot of different boxes. So it's going to be people who have the time to um, really engage on a volunteer basis. It's going to be funders. It's going to be folks with development expertise. You kind of need like an all of the above approach to this because it's no one skill set and no one kind of passion that is going to put this together.
Relatedly, there was a question that came up from the audience about what may be some of the difficulties in finding a co-developer, or what might be
Yeah,
some.
I'm glad that question got asked because I didn't really dig into it. So there are different kinds of co-developers out there, so it sort of depends on what their interests are, right? So Um, there are development partners that are really only interested in owning rental housing over the long term because they make their money back by engaging in property management, for example. Um, but there are also co-development partners who make their money in the developer fee that gets paid at the time of construction and generally paid out when a certificate of occupancy issues. So um, I shouldn't have said that it's hard, made it sound like it was impossible. It's not impossible. It's just a question of finding somebody whose interests align with this strategy and who um, probably has done home ownership before, even if they've never done a CLT before. If they've done home ownership before, then they're going to have a similar kind of model.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I would say to think about sometimes the private developers that may need some political capital to be able to move certain things, that there is that fair exchange of, hey, if you have a for-profit developer that wants to team up with the CLT to produce its housing, while at the same time they may need the community support to do a different project somewhere else, then there is that nuance to finding the right development partner that, on the surface, it's not all just nonprofit developers. It also could be some for-profit developers that may need some community backing to leverage to get an additional project done somewhere else in the city.
Great. This might be sort of further reinforcing this set of questions, but to really try and even close the loop on this kind of category of questions. Another question from the audience is, what do the few good people, quote unquote, tend to be in your experience? Not the members, but the few who get it started, professionals in the field, just lots of passion. So who else are we talking about? What are we maybe looking for?
So the groups that I work with in Connecticut are a real mix. Um, so I have a number of clients that are faith-based organizations. So it'll be a community development corporation sort of spun off by members of a church. That's pretty typical and common. And and great and lovely, and I enjoy working with those people. They're generally not nearly as supported as one would think they ought to be by the like higher ups in their religious institutions. So once you get beyond the parish level, you're almost like, what the? It's like a bureaucracy that really challenges I joke that I'm not sure whether it's worse working with HUD or with the diocese, and I don't mean I'm like no specific diocese, just diocese. But CDC is spun off by houses of worship are pretty common. They face a lot of the same scale issues that we've kind of alluded to. Community-based organizations in general. Neighborhood-based organizations that are either motivated by uh, the fact that they know that there's a need for affordable housing in their neighborhoods, or they know there's a piece of land, right, that could be better used, for example. So those are two buckets. I've also done a decent amount of work with housing authorities. In Connecticut, we have a number of suburban housing authorities that are basically all volunteer run. They do not look all that different than like a nonprofit, a volunteer run nonprofit. And I've done work with a number of them across the state as well. In the CLT context, I would say they check all of those boxes. It's the same people. There isn't necessarily a difference between who's choosing to do traditional homeownership versus rental versus CLTs. It's sort of a question of what kind of exposure folks have had to different options. Um,
And from my experience, the few good people have also lived through their legacy of looking back and actually not liking what they've done. So some of that is community development corporations, some of that is even Habitat for Humanity affiliates, where again, because they did not think long enough on the affordability pieces, that they have been almost helping sometimes gentrification to happen in a community because they thought 5 years, 10 years, maybe even 15 years was enough of an affordability mechanism and not think like with inside community land trust forever. So that's been a part of the work that I've been currently doing throughout the country is working with those Habitat for Humanity affiliates and local community development corporations that have been around for 30 years, 40 years. And unfortunately, they look back on the community and they're saying to themselves, wait a minute, none of my staff can actually afford to live here. We did something wrong.
So speaking about working with communities, to sort of talk even more formally in some sense about that, can a community land trust be established without the express support of the municipality? That I might pair that actually with a question as well from the audience, where one person asked, "What do you suggest as a tactic to entice your local municipality to embrace community land trusts as part of their affordable housing strategy?" And further remarking many towns don't seem to lack an understanding about this concept about CLT. So thinking about those two questions together.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll take the latter one, and that is really go to some of the institutions that they look towards. So, like the National League of Cities has done a huge piece on community land trust. The Lincoln Land Institute for Land Policy has done pieces on CLTs. The Brookings Institute. I mean, these are groups that actually municipalities usually look towards for inspiration and for guidance. And to, sometimes they don't know that these groups have created these resources for them to send them to those policy folks to actually understand that, oh no, other cities are doing this, and other cities are actually having a lot of good experiences with it, and it's actually helping in this era of housing crisis. This is one important tool in the toolbox.
Yeah. So I mean, I answer the question a little bit differently. So, um, do you need municipal support to do a CLT? There are two fundamental things that the municipality can provide. So one is you need zoning. And in Connecticut, we are like a walking, living, breathing fair housing violation. Many of our towns will not easily or gladly give you zoning or land use approvals to do um, any kind of housing where it's efficient and affordable to build it. And even when you've got a deeply subsidized CLT, you still can't spend, $1 million for a piece of land to build 2 units like you would have to do in much of Connecticut. So you're going to need land use and zoning. In that sense, you need municipal approval because those approvals come from municipalities. But we do, thank God, have a tool in Connecticut called the Affordable Housing Land Use Appeals Act that permits you as an affordable housing developer to go to your local land use authorities and say, I'm building affordable housing. If it's at least 30% affordable, and the CLT is typically going to be 100% affordable, then you have to give me my approvals unless I'm creating some kind of health and safety concern. And they'll kick and scream and they'll pretend like there's a health or safety concern, but there's at least a little bit of a chance that you'll get your approvals. And so, do you need municipal support to do that? No. And it's expensive and it's sad and it's pathetic that that's the way we do it in Connecticut, but at least there is that pathway available to you that does not exist actually in a lot of other states. So thank goodness for that. And a pox on the house of all of the legislators and advocates in the state who try to undo that legislation year after year. So that's one question in terms of municipal approval. The other thing you might hope that your municipality gives you is money. And there's two kind of buckets of money. So one is actual funding to help you build the thing. And then the second is some kind of property tax relief. So I'll start with the second bucket first. So under Connecticut state law, so this your town isn't the decider of what I'm about to describe, but under Connecticut state law, affordable housing is not actually a tax exempt purpose for property tax purposes, right? So the idea is that if you've got housing and people are actually either buying it or renting it, then that's not really like a tax exempt thing. Like they might be paying less for it than they otherwise would, but it's still like a taxable event kind of thing. Um, and even affordable rental housing, you're still making money off of it. Like it's just not treated as property tax exempt. Your local towns can decide that they're going to give a tax exemption for affordable housing. So there's something called a local option. Um, a sick and disgusting thing about the state of Connecticut, one of many, is that the towns that are more likely to give you a tax exemption are the ones that are poorer. And the wealthier towns often have no process by which to get a tax exemption for affordable housing because they don't actually want you to build it in the first place. They're hoping that they shut you out at the zoning door. They don't expect you to come in having gotten zoning approvals and now actually be seeking a tax exemption from the property taxes. Um, so it's much easier to get a payment in lieu or a fee in lieu here in the city of New Haven, where I live, than it is in any of the wealthy suburbs around here. And that's kind of too bad because a third of the housing here in New Haven is affordable. And it's sort of hard for the city to function when all of that housing is folks who are looking for property tax relief. So that isn't to say that if when I have a client who does affordable housing, we don't try to get that. I mean, we absolutely do then seek that relief, regardless of what town we're in. But it's just something to keep in mind as a systemic issue. Like one would hope that Guilford would provide those tax exemptions, and I actually don't know off the top of my head whether they do or they don't. I haven't done a development there, but I'm telling you right now that New Haven gives a lot more property tax relief to affordable housing than Guilford does. In terms of actual funding for development, uh, there are some pots of money that may be available less and less, every year as a result of um, federal policy, but also inflation, frankly. So there just aren't a lot of pots of money for that actually to subsidize development at the local level in Connecticut. Thankfully, as I mentioned before, there are significant chunks of money at the State Department of Housing and the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. But our towns are kind of small. Um, so the amount of money they have for this sort of thing, there may be a little bit of seed community development block grant or a little bit of home funds, and you might be able to get a little bit of money into a project from your town's economic development office or community development office if there is one, but it's not likely to be the thing that makes your project viable. There are towns in Connecticut that have a ton of money. They just have no interest in supporting affordable housing of any kind. So, forget trying to explain what a CLT is to them. As soon as you use the word affordable, they'll chase you out of their offices.
You might be really.
Is there
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I- actually I have a question because I see this throughout the country and wanted to know if Connecticut also thinks about this, that there is at least an acknowledgement that when CLTs do the ground lease and there is that restricted value on the property, that that is what gets taxed and not what the market valuation is.
Yeah, so there's a state law that in the case of rental housing requires the assessor to look at net operating income is my recollection, and I can pull the statute. Um, uh,
Yeah, we
but
dealt with this with the
what's
with
that?
Brookside 8-216.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah. Um, and I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of consistency of application, and it's a relatively recent thing. The statute's poorly written because it requires the building to be exclusively affordable, and
Okay.
that can you can get messed up if you've got, let's say, commercial on the first floor, or
Hmm.
you've got mixed income. And
Yep.
in Connecticut, almost all of the funding that exists encourages some kind of mixed income, even if it's only 10 or 20% market rate. So like right off the bat, if you're in a town where they want to fight with you, they'll fight with you. Um,
Okay.
and I'm not exactly sure how that plays out in a CLT. Frankly, I haven't really thought about it because we're in a CLT, you're not dealing with net operating income, you're dealing with um,
That's right.
I frankly myself have mixed feelings about this. I could slap a deed restriction on my house today that said, "Oh, I'm never going to sell it for more than $5," and then go to my tax assessor's office and say, "I only want to pay 5 cents of taxes on my house," and leave it to my kid. I mean, there's just it's not clear to me that um, and I might feel very, very differently if I weren't in a state where 95% of the affordable housing is located in our poorest municipalities.
Yeah.
But I am, and so it's hard not to be influenced by that
Yeah.
real fact of life.
Yeah, a lot of other cities and states actually have laws that dictate that because of the fact that, as we know, property tax increases can literally take an affordable house out of affordability. Just from an operating standpoint, that somebody that gets in there, that's great. But if you continue to just allow the market to appreciate at the levels that it does, then year after year that family is struggling just to take care of their property tax bill. So that was my curiosity.
Yeah, this was dealt with the Brookside housing cooperatives, and um it the city was attempting to actually in their reval basically assess us according to market rate to do a sales
Yeah.
comparison, and we were just kind of stunned. It wasn't just that there on the face of it, it appeared that we fell under what the statute said, but also factoring in that we have a ground lease, factoring in the bylaws and what exists. And even
Mhm.
then, it was a bit of a fight. And what I learned along that process, well, one, we had to have beyond litigation. There, we had to engage in a more public facing kind of campaign around this, which was largely successful. It wasn't perfect, but it was largely successful. But what I learned through that as well is that many municipalities do not
Mhm.
abide by this statute, and unfortunately, if you don't have the resources, and I've learned this as well, not just over the course of just hearing about this in terms of through elected officials, but hearing about it when raised among other nonprofit housing advocates or nonprofit housing developers, that this has been a continuous issue
Mhm.
across the state. So we have something on the books, but it's at best, it has been unevenly implemented.
Yeah, I mean, just
Yeah.
keep in mind that the concern here applies to every moderate income homeowner in the state, regardless of whether you live on a CLT property, right? So I've been an advocate for better property tax rebates, for refundable property tax rebates, for property tax rebates for renters, right? Calculated as an assumption of what you're probably paying in property. I think there's a lot of, um, I've been an advocate for fewer property taxing jurisdictions in the state, so county level property taxing, so that so that we no longer have an 11 mill rate in Greenwich and a 45 mill rate in a Hampton, um, there are solutions here, and they're big and they're hard. But if we were going to do real justice, it would be bigger than just CLTs.
And that segues well into I- I'll pair this as well, some of these questions. So there's a question of what geography should a new community land trust consider? And maybe more pairing this with a comment that was put in the chat from the audience as well, where one person remarked, thinking about how towns in rural Northwest Connecticut, primarily all volunteer nonprofits, now have projects with ground leases, and putting together a regional (parentheses opt-in) community land trust, thinking ahead to when energy and interest may wane in towns and keep the nonprofits going. But the ground leases need to be administered and the affordability needs to be preserved. And just to add my own feelings on this too, uh, what so much often gets lost, and I think this really goes well with what we're talking about in this webinar, is who is there to administer the ground lease and enact it and follow it and enforce it, but also more than enforce it, generate a culture that matches with it so that administering it is not under a context of potential conflict among the stakeholders
Mhm.
involved, but rather actually is serviced in such a way where it's enabling further development. And I say that in the sense of we've gone through in some of these presentations how difficult this process can be, and then adding the context of where you might be where, and not just in Connecticut but in other states as well, depending on what that might look like. So a lot of these pieces go together, but I wanted to frame it too in those terms. So yeah, the question of geography around CLTs within here in Connecticut, but maybe also elsewhere or generally.
Yeah. I mean, I think historically, CLTs in the community has really made their own geography of where they feel like their quote unquote area is. We constantly think about what would be the staffing level when you think about scale. And we have tested out, and it continues to prove that for every 75 units, you need one full-time equivalent in terms of stewardship, in terms of compliance, in terms of what you would think about for a minimum viable program is at least having one person that somebody can call when it's time for them to refinance or resell their home. Now, the challenge is when you get into larger geographies, then that 1 to 75 actually gets cut down quite a bit because of the fact that you got to take into account travel time of that CLT staff member to actually look at these properties. So even when we set up the CLT in Houston, Texas, one of the larger cities here in the United States, we had to give them a robust staff of 1 to 25 units because of their geographic spread that they had. And that's why they have so many staff members to handle that type of portfolio.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I really defer to Jason's expertise on this in terms of long-term longevity and stewardship and what the efficiencies look like. We do tend to do very small projects here in Connecticut. And there isn't just, it's not just that it's more efficient to do scale on the development side, as you just heard, there's an efficiency on the stewardship side um, as well. And what you might call, property management in a rental project is there as well. And particularly in recent years with costs of insurance and other kind of inputs into some of these things becoming very, very, very high. It's the smaller projects really, really struggling.
Related since we're talking about or touching on some of these structural constraints, there is a question as well from the audience asking, how do we deal with the contradiction between wealth building, that is an aspiration of many first-time home buyers, and the appreciation caps imposed by CLTs?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I know Jason has something to say on, I mean, what I would just say really quickly, and then maybe if you can treat this as a segue into what you'll say from like a national and historic perspective, is that I think of CLTs on a continuum. And there may be folks, no individual is forced to buy a CLT home over another kind of home, right? So you've got people in the marketplace making a decision like, I'm going to rent, I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to do a CLT. They are, we can trust people to kind of make some kinds of choices. Um, and uh, the CLT doesn't eliminate wealth building, it caps it. And it provides a really important on-ramp for a lot of people into market rate home ownership. So a large number of people whose first home is a CLT home after 6 or 7 years, right, which is kind of the average length that any one of us will own any one particular home, will sell that CLT home as people do and then take the capped appreciation that they took out of that in terms of whatever it might be, the 2% per year, the amount of money they put in, the amount of money they put into improvements, the amount of money they saved by not paying like gentrifying rents or what have you. And then if their priority is really market rate, uncapped wealth appreciation homeownership, it enables them to get into that marketplace. It is a really significant number of people who use the CLTs as a launching pad for market rate homeownership. Um, so for me, it's just another option, um, uh, and it doesn't have to be a contradiction.
Yeah, I actually see this as one of the biggest myths out there, that there is no wealth building when it comes to CLTs. The Lincoln Land Institute for Land Policy and Grounded Solutions did a 30-year statistical study on thousands of CLT transactions throughout the country. And every one of those homeowners walked away with at least 30 to 40 times what they brought to the table in terms of their own capital. So as what I would say if I was teaching my 101 course, I would love for my 401k to give me those types of returns. And I'm still waiting for that. But I would say CLTs, because of how much subsidy goes into that difference between what folks would be trying to get to at the market compared to what the CLT is actually selling them the home for, that there has not been, in my experience, and again, I've been doing this for quite some time, I have not heard of a CLT homeowner be underwater. And that's even during the 2008, 2009 foreclosure crisis, where the entire market collapsed. But we had enough subsidy built into these deals that if folks wanted to actually go ahead and sell their homes, they were walking away on an upside of that transaction compared to the vast majority of us that were trying to sell our homes at that time period, and we were actually seeing losses. So, I mean, I hear folks that think about caps and think about this idea of, oh, I'm not getting something. And to the point of, well, if it's not for the programs like the CLT, then you may not get anything. So, and it's also important to realize that when we talk about appreciation, we are talking just about that. We are not talking about the equity gain that these folks have had, whether it's 7 years, 10 years, 20 years of paying down that principal. They get all of that back 100%. It's really that market appreciation that CLTs are capping and restricting, and not what all of us as homeowners are able to get, our equity 100%. So in some ways, those CLT homeowners and regular homeowners still get back that equity. It's really the appreciation side of this coin that we want to try to, cap and protect to give another person an opportunity to get into home ownership.
This maybe is a bit of a pivot, but this goes back to and it comes to mind in part because we're talking about people and people involved. Uh, Another question I have is what is needed to establish a community land trust in Connecticut, but more specifically to hone in. Of course, we've been talking about this as a discussion, but what other professionals might need to be involved? Besides, is an attorney required? It's probably recommended. What other professions would be recommended or required or suggested? What's maybe maybe better put, what's maybe a best practice around some of these things in terms of people or professionals to involve?
I 100% think lawyers are generally overrated. There will, however, come a time, and you don't know how many times a day I talk people out of needing my services, but there will come a time when you are acquiring the land and acquiring the funding, and people will literally require you to have an attorney. So part of the question, I think, like with a lot of this, is not just who you need, but who you need when. Um, and when it comes to lawyers, I have a particular specialization and expertise on when it is that people need lawyers. I do think it is possible to bring an attorney in too early and to get hung up with a lot of questions about, like, again, like finessing your bylaws or finessing your certificate of incorporation instead of being out there meeting people, building those networks, building the community, talking to um, the funders and others who are really going to enable you to do the thing. Um, so ultimately, yeah, you're going to need lawyers and architects and funding consultants, like all of these things. Um, and it's more a question of timing and getting the timing right, than it is trying to either um, avoid or not, bringing in some of those kinds of specialized folks.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, as a consultant that sets up CLTs throughout the country, very rarely do we actually request or even require attorneys. And a lot of times we require attorneys for the very last minute. Review this and make sure it conforms with state law. We don't need your advice on how it's written. We know how to write these things. We just want to make sure that we're not going to get ourselves in trouble with the state. Having somebody that also understands from even the profit side of this equation can really be helpful in terms of that perspective. I've worked with really small neighborhood groups that want to start a CLT. And then I've also worked with groups that are very similar, but they bring in a person that is like a program officer of a foundation or a bank executive. And their minds are just, conditioned very differently than how the neighbors want to do this. But just by a small tweak, it actually improves it. So bringing in different perspectives, I think, is incredibly important from a professional standpoint of bring us your advice, bring us your different ideas. But I do agree that sometimes the attorneys will get wrapped up in sometimes a liability spin of, oh, well, we want to protect you. And to me, I've always said these documents can always be changed, guys. This is not written in stone. This is not like we're giving up somebody's firstborn. We can definitely go back and amend these documents at a specific time that we feel like, but to the point of get to the work is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, the attorneys can do that, but also, frankly, when your clients reel into democracy, which CLTs tend to do, the clients can do that too.
Mhm.
Right. So you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out like what the right quorum number is or something like that. And it's not that that stuff isn't important. Um, it's just that I have literally seen organizations that spend 18 months trying to figure it out, and by the end, everyone's too tired to do the thing that they meant to do.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. The fastest that we've been able to set up a CLT is 6 months. And that's with a very dedicated group that's willing to take week by week and be able to have the conversations, hear the recommendations, and keep moving forward, knowing that a project is the ultimate goal.
To that, what as experts in community land trusts would you consider to be a gold standard or best practices for starting a community land trust? Of course, we've talked through a lot of things, but are there maybe a few, maybe one or two even, practices that you would say that's a best practice and really hold on to that and execute that?
To me, in all the years that I've been doing this, I've always said to groups, the model at this point has proven itself as being true. Um, don't overcomplicate it. Because to the point, you can have groups that are just like, oh, we want to do our new version of what a CLT is, and we want to do this new innovative piece. And it's just like, guys, we have houses that need to be built. We got projects that need to be done. Let's stop overthinking this. Let's get some of the foundational pieces in place and let's move. It will evolve over time. Every CLT, going all the way back to some of the first CLTs, have evolved tremendously in terms of the housing stock that they actually prioritize, through how they interact with community, through how they actually do new innovative social enterprises along with the traditional models. So for me, I've always said to groups, don't overthink it. Let's just get it done.
Yeah, I mean, I'd endorse all of that. Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
this question sort of flows out of this, but also again touches upon some of the things we've discussed. Very broad question, but specific things may come to mind. Where do funds come from to set up a community land trust? How much is needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say it all depends on what level of starting up are you doing. If you engage a consultant like Grounded Solutions Network, it's going to be a few $100,000 between the consultancy that we bring through the filing fees, through getting your first staff member, that's what it's going to cost. Now where it comes from is a variety of different sources, whether it's, the local philanthropic community to even some of your banks that have philanthropic arms that want to go ahead and do this. The one thing, and I know it's not necessarily the sentiment in your state, but in other states, we're actually seeing a lot of municipalities come to the table and say, we'll pay for the consultant, community, you help design it and you get it started. So, especially when a lot of cities, as we just came out of the pandemic, and a lot of these cities were trying to figure out where to put the ARPA dollars, the American Rescue Plan dollars, a number of those dollars went into establishing new CLTs throughout the country. So to me, I feel like, you turn over every stone and you get a nickel, you put it into there. I have one CLT in Michigan that has been really creative in going around to the businesses and driving a profit sharing of, hey, can we get 10% of your profits if we drive people to your business on this day? Just really creative ways that they've been able to crowdsource the funds to be able to get themselves off the ground. But I would say the most prolific one to date has been actually not even foundations, but it's been municipalities from what I've seen throughout the country.
Yeah, in Connecticut, the biggest funder of new affordable housing construction is the state. Some of that is money that is flowing to the state from the federal government. Some of it is um, money that the state's putting on the table in terms of bonded dollars. It is true that during the pandemic, there was a lot of ARPA dollars floating around, and there are municipalities that put that money into affordable housing. I'm not specifically aware of any city, and maybe Alex, you are, of any municipality in the state that put it into CLT. Although I am aware of a number, like a large number, that did put it into some kind of affordable housing, including affordable homeownership. But we haven't seen, and we've seen a trickle of activity around CLTs in the state. We have yet to see like a watershed moment.
Yeah. I mean, I will just give the plug to everyone that's on the call that the 21st Century Road to Housing Act that has actually been pretty much like, passed in their own versions in the House and the Senate on the federal level may be the first time that CLTs and shared equity programs are going to possibly get a dedicated funding source through the federal government. So this is something that we're really excited at Grounded Solutions. We put a lot of work into getting this to where it is today, especially through all the revisions and all of the cuts that are measures that we put in there, where we talk about CLTs, we talk about the need for housing, we talk about a different way that funds can actually flow directly from HUD to CLTs and not necessarily need to go through municipalities in utilizing the Promised Neighborhoods design that the Department of Education did with nonprofits is what we're really excited about. That again, we may be able to see this generational turn where we're going to see some true resources to this model.
Okay, we're approaching time. Are there anything else that you either of you would like to share about community land trusts, creating one, maybe even we touched a little bit about, servicing the ground lease, anything like that in terms of, what is it maybe? Actually, I do have a final question might relate to that. I talked myself into one. Uh, is there anything maybe in the development process or the creation process that might be particularly helpful that flows through into the stewardship part component? That might be, I'm- maybe that's a very large question,
Yeah.
but maybe are there certain things early on in setting the foundation that are really helpful for keeping it going?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind, and it relates to the fundraising, is that while government sources are often the biggest chunk of development, you do need, it can be various of the kinds of streams that Jason just mentioned, but you do need a way to have ongoing revenue that's not tied to the development, right? So, the whether that's charitable giving or foundations or whatever it is, uh, that development process ends up being like a huge influx of money to build the thing, but then it gets spent building the thing, and then anything before, which is pre-development, anything after, which is stewardship, you have to have a separate mechanism for funding. And I do see people forgetting that piece. Um, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest advice around like the sustainability and how we can set up a really great foundation. And again, Grounded Solutions, we came out with a policies and procedures template manual. And that's honestly when we do our technical assistance work and our fee for service work, we predominantly focus on those policies and procedures before we even touch a ground lease, because we really want folks to understand these are the levels of responsibility that you're going to have to be in charge of after you sell a home to somebody or after you're starting to rent out a building. These are core. You can throw anything into a ground lease, and our model ground lease is intentionally legally vague from what the author has shared with me over the years. And it's predominantly because they really wanted great policies and procedures that can evolve over time without always going back to that legal document. So my biggest advice around setting a really great foundation is don't skip over the important elements of policies and procedures when it comes to stewardship, because a lot of groups want to jump all the way to that ground lease and want to start customizing it and everything like that. And one of the big jobs we have to do as their consultants is pull them back and say no, as what John Davis, one of the godfathers of the CLT model, would say, you have to eat your vegetables before you eat your main course. Your vegetables are these policies and procedures. We got to make sure that we have these down packed. Let's have the conversations. Let's figure out where you want to go, because it's about the staffing level that you're going to need. It's about the care that you're going to put into these potential homeowners and renters after the fact. And then we'll solidify it in this legal document. But let's make sure that we have these things in place before we just rush ahead.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you again. Thank you both, Anika. Thank you, Jason. I've learned a lot, and this was a really great window into thinking about the whole arc of a CLT, and how so much of the beginning really sets us up for the work day to day, moving forward. To everyone who's joined us, thank you for joining us. And again, please look to the prior webinars if you've not participated or seen them. They are on the Housing Collective YouTube channel. They're likely accessible through other platforms as well. But thank you for joining us. This is a partnership through various organizations. And again, look to the Housing Collective YouTube channel for prior webinars and share this recording when this one is up. Thank you all.